It wasn't a bride who stepped off that wagon. It was 7 dusty kids, a torn-up letter with no promises, and a past Eli thought he'd buried in ash. But sometimes what fate delivers is the family you never dared to dream of. Eli Mercer shaved that morning, first time in months. He laid out the white shirt, the one with pearl snaps, and a collar that didn't quite lie flat anymore. Ironed it best he could with a cast-iron plate heated over the stove. Then he swept the porch, knocked dust off the rockers, even poured water in a chipped basin outside in case Clara wanted to freshen up after the ride. She'd written she didn't mind dirt, said she preferred wide skies to city lamps. Still, a man ought to make a decent first impression. He paced the yard slow, boots crunching gravel like old thoughts underfoot. The desert had bloomed that week, a rare spring miracle. Yellow brittlebush and purple verbena splashed color across the ridges. Eli reckoned it was a good sign, maybe even a kind one. By noon, the wind had picked up, and with it came the sound of wheels. He turned, heart stiff in his chest like an old hinge. But it wasn't her. It was a man. Old, bent, dusty as the wagon he drove. The rig creaked to a stop near the gate, and Eli counted them one by one. 7 small figures huddled in the back, like shadows that didn't want the light. The man climbed down, joints cracking louder than the saddle leather. "You Eli Mercer," the old-timer rasped. "I am," Eli said, already feeling something strange taking root in his gut. The man didn't offer his hand, just nodded once, went around back, and lifted a tin box down from under the wagon seat, handed it over like it was nothing, like it was just a sack of oats. Inside, folded once, was a note written in a slanted, hurried script. Eli didn't have to read it twice. "They need you more than I do. See." He looked up. The man had already started unloading. 1 girl, 2 boys, another girl, a set of twins with matching cuts on their arms, a little one with eyes too old for her face. 7 in all, barefoot or worse. None of them cried. None of them spoke. Eli just stood there. Shirt too white, hands too clean, house too quiet for what had just arrived. "Frank, that was the old man's name," he finally said. Nodded toward the children. "They been through hell. Don't ask them to talk. Not yet." "Where's Clara?" Eli asked, though he already knew the answer. "She ain't coming. Not now. Maybe not ever." The man climbed back onto the wagon. "You got questions, write 'em to the wind. That's where she sent her answers." And just like that, he left. Dust swirled behind the wagon, and for a long time Eli didn't move. The wind slapped at his sleeves, tugged at the letter in his hand. The oldest boy, tall, skinny, with dark hair and darker eyes, stepped forward. "You want us gone, just say it now," he said, voice calm, dead calm. "We won't fight." Eli looked past him, to the girl clutching a ragged cloth rabbit, to the twin boys standing so close their arms touched, to the silence that hung like smoke from a fire long gone cold. He cleared his throat, but what came out was gravel. "I reckon you all should come inside." They didn't answer, just followed him up the steps, 7 shadows, 7 ghosts, and crossed the threshold of a house that was supposed to welcome a bride. Instead, it welcomed something else entirely, something he wasn't ready for, something he couldn't turn away, not after that note. "They need you more than I do. And Lord, help him." A part of him believed that was true. Mornings in Silver Hollow came with dust, wind, and the low groan of the land remembering something cruel. Eli rose early. He always did. War does that to a man, leaves him waking before dawn, listening for sounds that aren't there. But this time, there were sounds, small ones. Breath, shifting weight, wood creaking under tiny feet. No laughter, no sleep talk like children ought to have. Just movement, cautious, controlled. They hadn't run, yet. He brewed coffee, the real kind, black as coal and twice as bitter. It filled the kitchen with that smell he once thought meant home. Will was already sitting at the table, back straight, eyes on the window like a guard dog. "You're up early," Eli said, casual. "Didn't sleep." "Too quiet," Will shook his head. "Too safe." Eli didn't ask. The rest filtered in, quiet as ghosts. June moved like her bones ached, though she couldn't be more than 10. Emma clung to her rabbit like it might float away. Jake and Jim sat shoulder to shoulder. You could have mistaken them for one person if not for the way their hands twitched opposite. Sarah still didn't speak, but she stared hard like she was reading something on Eli's face he couldn't see himself. He laid out bread, apples, a jar of honey he'd been saving since spring. None of them touched it. "You don't like honey?" he tried. Jake's voice came, hoarse. "It's too nice." Eli blinked. Will added, "When food's good, it means you owe something." June nodded. "Or someone'll take it away halfway through." Eli let the words settle like dust on saddle leather. Then he sat, slow and heavy. "You don't owe me, and no one's taking nothing here." "That's what they said last time," Will said. Not even bitter, just plain tired. Then the fire came. Then the man with the cane. Then we stopped asking questions. Eli's hand tightened around his cup. The coffee had gone cold. He looked at them, not just saw them, but looked. Bruises in places they'd tried to hide. Scars older than their eyes. Movements too measured for childhood. These weren't orphans. They were refugees from something the world hadn't dared name. He tried again. "You're safe now." Silence. Then a whisper. June, eyes half shut, words slurred like sleep-talking. He said he'd burn us next if we ran. Everyone froze. Eli turned slowly. June hadn't even realized she spoke. She stared ahead, not at the fire, but into it. Her fingers clenched around the hem of her dress, where the fabric was scorched, barely noticeable unless you were looking. Emma leaned closer. Caleb laid a hand on her shoulder. Will said nothing, but his jaw locked like a steel hinge. Eli stood. "I'm going to check the fence," he said. No one moved. Outside, the wind had picked up. The sky was bleached and wide, no clouds, just sun and space. He walked the perimeter. Every post, every wire, every gate. He checked them like they were the only thing keeping evil out. Maybe they were. By the time he circled back, Sarah was on the porch. Still silent, still staring. She held something in her hand. A stone, maybe, or a tooth. He couldn't tell. When their eyes met, she didn't flinch. Instead, she mouthed something he couldn't hear. Not yet, but he knew what it meant. These children didn't need kindness, they needed proof. There are things a man doesn't ask, not because he doesn't want to know, but because asking means admitting the answer might wreck him. That evening, Eli fixed up the barn loft for the boys, hung lanterns, laid out blankets stuffed with hay, hauled up a rusted stove from the cellar, and got it to cough out some warmth. He didn't say much. Didn't need to. The silence inside the house spoke louder than any supper prayer ever could. It was June who screamed first, short, sharp, and then nothing but the sound of wood banging as Eli threw open the bedroom door. Will had already stood up. So had Caleb. June sat curled in the far corner of the bunk, holding her little sister Emma like a sack of flour, her eyes wide and not here, not now. Eli didn't ask what she saw. He just knelt by the bed, slowly, open hands. "She was dreaming," Caleb muttered. "It happens." Eli nodded. "Bad ones, huh?" Will added flatly. "They're always bad." Psst. Later, after they had gone quiet again, Eli found himself on the porch with a tin lamp and his thoughts. Caleb stepped outside without a sound, just stood beside him looking out into the dark. After a long silence, Eli said, "You move quiet for a boy your size." "I was trained to," Caleb said. That caught him. "You mean like army trained?" "No, sir, not army, just trained." Another beat of wind. Eli turned to look. Caleb didn't meet his eyes. "Why don't you tell me what that means, son?" Caleb finally looked up, and in the light of the lantern, Eli saw something that made his stomach turn. Not fear, not guilt, shame. "I used to watch," the boy said. "They told me I was smart, that I could tell which ones were planning to run." Eli's mouth went dry. "You were one of them?" Caleb nodded. "I never hurt nobody, just told. Where they were, what they said when they thought no one heard." "Why?" "Because they said if I didn't, they'd burn June next." That name landed like a nail in wood. Caleb swallowed hard. "I stopped telling. One day I didn't give them what they wanted. I said I couldn't find her, that I'd lost track. Next morning I woke up with rope around my wrists and a boot to the ribs." He turned then, pulled up the sleeve of his shirt. There, across the forearm, was a welt, raw and crooked like someone had pressed hot iron across skin and held it there. "They tossed me out like trash." Eli looked at the boy. No, young man, and saw not a traitor, not a spy, but someone who'd been taught betrayal long before he knew loyalty. "You did what you had to do to survive," Eli said quietly. "No," Caleb whispered. "I did it because I was scared. I thought if I helped them, I'd matter." A gust of cold ran through the porch. Caleb's next words were nearly inaudible. "I thought if I mattered, they'd stop hurting us." Eli took a deep breath, then did something he hadn't done in a long while. He reached out and put a hand on the boy's shoulder. Caleb flinched, but didn't pull away. "Out here," Eli said, "we don't measure a man by what he's done under chains. We measure him by what he does once they're off." Caleb looked at him, then slowly nodded. That night, Eli couldn't sleep. He walked the house like a ghost. In the hallway, he passed Sarah's room. The girl still hadn't spoken a word, but her eyes followed him, watched him like she knew something was changing. And outside, the wind howled low, like the land remembered too many secrets. The sun slid low behind the ridge like a tired outlaw, bleeding orange over the crags of Silver Hollow. Eli was chopping wood when it happened. 3 sharp knocks, not frantic, not lost, just deliberate, confident, like someone who had knocked on a lot of doors before, and never needed permission to enter. He stood still for half a second, axe midair. Another knock, slower now. He grabbed the rifle from the porch rail, not because he wanted to use it, but because in this part of New Mexico only 2 kinds of folks knocked after sundown, preachers or trouble. And no preacher rode into Silver Hollow in the dead of dust season. He opened the door halfway. 3 men stood outside, dust-covered wide hats, guns slung too loose on their hips to be casual. One leaned on a cane, polished blackwood, silver top. His face was lined like leather stretched too long in the sun. He smiled without warmth. "Evenin', mister?" Eli said nothing. The man motioned toward the barn with his chin. "Big place. You running stock?" "No stock," Eli said. The man smiled wider. "Just little ones, then?" The silence after that was the kind that made dogs whimper. Eli's finger shifted on the rifle stock. "I reckon you're lost," he said. One of the younger men, maybe 20, took a step forward. "We're looking for something. Went missing a few days back. Heard a wagon pass through Dry Creek loaded with some merchandise. Thought maybe it took a wrong turn." Eli said evenly, "This ain't a store, and I don't deal in merchandise." The man with the cane chuckled. "No, you don't. Not anymore." He tipped his hat, slow. "But here's the thing. What's lost don't stay lost forever. Things tend to circle back. Sooner or later. He glanced toward the barn again. Nice place. Would be a shame if fire got to it. Eli stepped out, gun low but forward. You threaten me on my own land. The old man lifted his hands. Threat's such an ugly word. Think of it as a courtesy call. He turned to leave, but stopped midway. Oh, one more thing. He reached into his coat. Eli stiffened, but the man only pulled out a scrap of paper, half burnt at the edges, tossed it toward the porch. Eli let it float down, then picked it up. It was singed, faded, smelled faintly of smoke, but two words were still clear, written in a tight, panicked scrawl, Red Mill. By the time Eli looked up, the men were already mounting up. As they disappeared into the dust, Eli stood alone, paper trembling in his hand. Behind him, from the shadows inside the house, a small voice whispered. It was June. He found us. They came just after sunrise. Not a shout, not a warning, just the crack of a rifle from the edge of the canyon. Splinters off the barn post, inches from Eli's head. The children screamed. Eli dropped the feed pail and rolled behind the porch rail, Winchester already warm in his grip. From the dust clouds, 5 figures advanced on horseback. Same hats, same coats as the ones from the night before, only, this time, less polite. Bullets bit into the walls of the house. One tore through the window where Sarah had been sitting just seconds earlier. Down! Eli roared, pulling the girl flat with one arm as he returned fire. One clean shot that forced a rider to veer off, clutching his shoulder. Inside, Will was herding the smaller ones into the cellar. Move! Come on, Emma, now! June grabbed a dull apple knife from the kitchen, her face pale but her jaw set like iron. In the barn, Eli kept low, heart pounding. The face of one of the attackers came into view. Close now, and it stopped him cold. Benny Two Cards Mathis, a friend, a brother-in-arms once from the war. He'd shared firelight and canteen water with Eli in Tennessee. Now he was firing at the house Eli called home. Eli didn't hesitate long. He raised the rifle and pulled the trigger. The bullet caught Benny's horse square in the flank, sent both man and beast tumbling. Eli didn't aim for Benny, but the message was clear. I remember you, and I'll still stop you. The firefight raged for 10 long minutes that felt like half a war. Dust choked the yard. The barn took 2 more hits. Jim, one of the twins, started crying, but Will hushed him gently, arms wrapped tight. Outside, one man tried flanking from the well. That's when June moved. Silent as dusk, she slipped through the side door and crept up behind him, blade clenched in her teeth. When he turned, she didn't hesitate. The blade found his thigh. He went down with a roar. June ran back inside, gasping, eyes wide. Not with fear, but something colder, something practiced, something that didn't belong on a girl her age. When the dust finally cleared, 2 horses were left riderless. The rest fled toward the east ridge, leaving behind cursing, wounded breath and blood in the grass. Eli stood in the yard, panting, shirt torn, smoke still coiling from his rifle. Inside, Sarah peeked out, her voice trembling. Is it over? Eli didn't answer. He was looking at the man he'd shot down, Benny, who now crawled on one elbow, muttering, Didn't think you'd actually shoot. Eli knelt beside him. You forgot who I was. Benny coughed blood. No, I remembered. That's why I aimed for the barn. Eli stiffened. This ain't over, Eli. Red Mill's just the mouth. You ain't seen the belly yet. Then he passed out. It took Eli hours to stop shaking. He'd dug trenches, buried comrades, stared down men charging with bayonets. And yet, this was different. This was children crying under his roof, a girl stabbing a grown man with a kitchen knife, and a friend, no, a brother, lying unconscious in his barn. By the time the sun touched the hills, the ranch was quiet again. Will was watching the perimeter with Caleb, both holding rusty rifles. June sat sharpening her apple knife, her face blank as old timber. The twins slept back to back in the hay, and Sarah was writing something in the dirt with a broken stick. Eli walked past her, heading to the back room where Caleb had been waiting. The boy had asked for privacy. Now, seated on the floor with a blanket over his knees, Caleb looked up and said plainly, "It's not over." Eli nodded, leaning on the doorframe. "I figured that out when bullets hit my porch." Caleb didn't smile. "They'll be back, with more men. Real ones, not drunks with boots and borrowed spurs." Eli crossed his arms. "Why? Who the hell are you people?" Silence. Caleb looked down at his hands, burned, calloused, scarred in ways Eli hadn't noticed before. "We weren't just orphans," the boy said slowly. "We were property." Eli's jaw clenched. Caleb continued, voice tightening. "They took us to a place called Red Mill. It's not a town, not even a real mill, just an old mine covered up with fresh lumber and lies. Deep inside there's a tunnel system, no light, no name, just numbers on the kids' backs." Eli sat down on a nearby crate. "They made us dig, not for gold, for something black, coal dust thicker than your breath. We slept underground, ate moldy bread, and if you slowed down, you disappeared." His throat tightened. "They called it salvaging. Said we were trash from the war. Said the world didn't need us." Eli felt bile rise in his throat. "And the men today?" "Just hired muscle," Caleb whispered. "But they all work for him." "Who?" Caleb looked up, and in his eyes was the kind of fear Eli hadn't seen since the trenches. Ambrose Kincaid. The name hit like a hammer. A name spoken in politics and parlors, railway baron, mine owner, philanthropist, honored in the capital for rebuilding the West. Eli had seen his face once, on a poster at the bank, "Progress needs iron." "And Clara?" Eli asked. Caleb finally nodded. "She's not just a mail-order bride. She's the one who got us out. She bought the time, forged the papers, bribed the wagon. Said she had a man she trusted out west, a man who didn't flinch from fire." Eli swallowed hard. "She was supposed to come too," Caleb added, "but something went wrong. She stayed behind to throw them off. She said she'd write." Eli leaned back, staring at the ceiling. 100 emotions twisted through him. Rage, shame, sorrow, disbelief. All this time he'd been waiting for a woman to save him. Turns out she'd been saving someone else. 7 someones. He got up slowly, reached into his coat, and pulled out the folded note he'd kept since the morning. "They need you more than I do." The wind shifted that night. It didn't howl, just moved, like something breathing low in the tall grass, the kind of wind that carried dust instead of rain, and whispers instead of truth. Eli stood on the porch, lantern in hand. The flame inside it flickered, not from the wind, but from the tension in his own bones. Caleb's words from earlier had stuck like burrs under skin. Kincaid, Red Mill, Clara. He hadn't slept. He couldn't. Not with the weight of 7 children behind his walls and the promise of violence galloping closer with every heartbeat. And then he saw them. First, the silhouettes, just shadows against a darker sky. No moonlight, no torch, but the sound, that unmistakable rhythm of hooves. Slow, heavy, deliberate. 10 riders, not cowhands, not drunks. Men in long coats, rifles slung like truth waiting to be spoken, and faces hidden behind wide-brimmed hats and black scarves. They didn't speak, didn't need to. Eli stepped down off the porch, shotgun tucked under his arm, and walked until his boots sank into the dust of the front yard. They stopped 20 yards out. A man dismounted, tall, with a limp and a toothpick hanging from his mouth. His voice, when it came, was thin as old rope. "Evenin', Mr. Mercer." Eli didn't respond. "We came for what was stolen." Eli raised his chin. They ain't goods. The man smiled, not kindly. Neither are debts, but someone's got to pay 'em. Inside the house, Will and Caleb crouched near the windows. Sarah clutched her wooden slate to her chest. June had her knife. Eli saw the twitch in one rider's gloved hand, the kind of twitch a man gets when he's already decided how he's going to kill, just not when. He tensed his grip on the shotgun, but before anything else could happen, a shot rang out, sharp, clean. One rider yelped, toppled from his saddle. The rest spun in confusion, weapons half drawn. But the bullet hadn't come from the house. Eli turned toward the sound, the edge of the tree line, and there, crawling, not walking, through the shadows was a man, covered in dried blood, face battered and one arm dangling uselessly. He wore no hat, no badge, just a ripped vest, one boot, and around his neck a rosary made of black string. In his working hand, a rusted Colt peacemaker. He fired again. Another horse reared. The riders shouted, now more scattered than brave. The wounded man reached the porch. Eli rushed down and grabbed him. He tried to speak, but his throat was torn. Instead, he pressed the rusted gun into Eli's palm, then tapped his own chest, then pointed at the house. Caleb ran out, gasped. "Bo," he whispered. "That's Bo." Eli looked down at the broken man. "You one of Clara's?" The man blinked once. Eli nodded, lifted him with one arm, and carried him inside. The riders didn't attack, not that night. Maybe they weren't ready for a house that fired back. Maybe they were just waiting for orders from someone who hadn't spoken yet. But Eli knew now. This wasn't over. This wasn't even the beginning. At dawn, the world looked like it was holding its breath. The horizon glowed red. Not from sunrise, but from dust and smoke rising beyond the ridge. Eli stood beside the porch rail, hand tight around the rusted Colt Bo had given him. The man's blood had dried on the handle. He hadn't spoken a word since collapsing, but the pain in his eyes said plenty. Inside the house, the children gathered in the kitchen. June stood by the window with her knife. Caleb loaded shells into a lever-action rifle. Will stared at the door. Eli didn't say much. He just nodded once to Will. "Help me seal the north fence." The boy followed without question. That morning, the old ranch turned into something else. A fort, a final stand, a place where fences weren't for cattle anymore. They were for holding out evil long enough to matter. Barrels of water were rolled beside each entrance, feed bags stacked as makeshift barricades. Kitchen knives became weapons, the cellar stocked with jerky, matches, and bullets. Bo lay in the corner of the main room, one hand clutching his gut, the other pointing toward the hills every time a shadow moved. And then they came. Not 10 this time. More. 20, maybe 30. Men in matching coats, riding with quiet hunger. Not raiders. These were trained, bought, fed on orders and blood. Eli met them halfway down the slope, rifle over his shoulder like a preacher with a cross. "You got one chance," he said. "Ride back and live." A man in a gray duster laughed. "We ain't here to live, Mr. Mercer." And that's when the shooting started. It wasn't clean. Nothing about it was. It was smoke and dirt and shouts and horses, bucking in blood. The sound of splintered wood. The hiss of a bullet skimming too close. Eli fired until his shoulder screamed, then fired again. Will dropped to one knee, steady aim, steady breath, like he was born for it. June lunged out when one rider jumped the fence, and her knife found ribs fast and sure. Caleb saw a man taking aim at the window where Emma and Sarah crouched. He didn't think. He just ran. His body took the bullet meant for the girls, and he crashed into the shooter, knocking both of them down the slope. June screamed his name, scrambled after him, but the dust swallowed them both. Inside, Eli dragged Bo to the rear window. "Can you shoot?" he asked. The man coughed blood, nodded. Eli handed him his own rifle, then turned back to the door. And that's when it happened. A scream. Not a child's, Will's. Eli whipped around in time to see the boy collapse. A bullet lodged in his shoulder. He ran to him, cradled the blood-soaked shirt, heart pounding louder than any gunfire. Will gasped, "Don't let them take us." Eli's eyes burned. He looked up, saw the next wave of riders coming, and something snapped. The man who had once laid flowers on his family's grave every Sunday now roared like a wounded bear. He kicked open the door, shotgun in one hand, revolver in the other, and walked straight into the storm. He wasn't fighting for land. He wasn't fighting for pride. He was fighting for 7 broken souls who still believed a home could be real. The rain didn't wait for the gunfire to stop. It came hard and cold, as if the sky itself had been holding back until the last bullet left its chamber. Drops slapped the roof, the fence, the torn shirts, and bleeding wounds, soaking into everything. Blood, dirt, ash. Eli stood in the middle of the yard, chest heaving, arms slack. Smoke curled from the barrel of his shotgun. His shirt clung to him, soaked red in spots that weren't his. His face was empty, except for his eyes. Those still burned. Behind him, the children huddled in the kitchen. June sat beside Caleb's limp body, cradling his hand, lips trembling but no tears falling. Will groaned every now and then from the corner, fever already rising in his broken frame. Bo had passed out again. Sarah sat by the window, her small hand gripping Emma's. They were still alive, but they were running out of miracles. Then hooves, not from the ridge, not from the front, from the west. It wasn't like the last time. No dust cloud, no yells, no chaos. Just a line of riders moving silent in the downpour, their badges barely catching what little light the gray sky offered. Marshal Hoyt Rayner led them. He rode a thick-chested bay horse, wore a coat darker than the storm, and had a rifle strapped across his saddle like it belonged there since birth. His eyes scanned the field, the bodies, the broken gate, the boy bleeding through bandages. He didn't say a word for a long moment. Then he dismounted, walked straight up to Eli. "You look like hell, Mercer." Eli didn't smile, just nodded. "You're late." The old marshal spat rain from his mustache. "You're not dead, so I ain't that late." Behind him, the riders began disarming the wounded, cuffing the ones still breathing, pulling children out from hiding places in the barn where some had fled. Hoyt knelt beside Caleb, checked his pulse, shook his head. "He was the spy, wasn't he?" he said quietly. Eli nodded again. "He turned," Eli said, "gave his life for the others. Then he died clean." Inside the house, Clara staggered through the door. She was pale, soaked to the bone, and holding her side where blood seeped between her fingers. Eli froze. "You said you weren't coming back," he growled. Clara looked at him, teeth chattering. "Yeah, well, you always were terrible at keeping women away." And then she collapsed. They worked fast. Clara was lifted onto a cot. A traveling nurse in the marshal's crew stitched her wound. The kids were fed. Will got morphine. Caleb's body was covered with Eli's own coat. The storm began to ease as the sky cracked open to blue. Marshal Hoyt stood with Eli on the porch, drinking bitter coffee, steam curling into the clean air. "She contacted me 3 days ago," Hoyt said. "Told me if I didn't come now, I might not get another chance to do the right damn thing in this county." Eli kept his eyes on the hills. She was right. Hoyt took another sip. "Ambrose Kincaid's running. Slipped out of Albuquerque last night. We'll catch him." Eli's jaw tightened. "He doesn't get a quick trial, not after this." Hoyt looked over at him. "No," he said, "not quick, but just—" There was a pause. Then Eli spoke again, his voice low, raw. "She saved them, Hoyt. She saved me." The marshal nodded. And you? You planning on saving her back? Eli didn't answer, but his hand gripped the porch rail and didn't let go. The house smelled of smoke, iron, and boiled potatoes. Someone had left the pot too long on the stove, but no one had the heart to care. Will lay still in the back room, fever cooling slowly. Bo had been moved to the barn where it was quieter. The rest of the children, those who could walk, swept ash from the floorboards and wiped blood from windows. They worked not because anyone told them to, but because there was nothing else left to do. Eli stood in the washroom, knuckles bloodied, breath short. The mirror in front of him was cracked. His fist had done that a minute ago. But the image staring back? That was older and deeper, and not cracked enough to blur. A man with eyes worn down to dust, with skin that hadn't felt joy in a decade, with a shirt still stained by someone else's blood. A man who, just hours ago, had wrapped a boy's body in his coat and told a girl to hold her sister tighter. He wasn't waiting for a bride anymore. He was waiting to know who the hell he'd become. Behind him the door creaked. Mr. Mercer. It was Sarah, the youngest, her voice still unsure whether she had the right to speak. Eli turned, gentler now. She held a folded paper, slightly damp, smudged in ink. Miss Clara said, "You should see this." He opened it slowly. It was a list. 7 names, 7 stories, names scratched out, towns abandoned, parents gone, all tied to the same camps, same networks of indenture, same cruel chain that ended with Ambrose Kincaid's smiling portrait on the front page of the Capital Tribune. At the bottom of the page, Clara had scribbled something in smaller print. They're not lost anymore, but they ain't found yet either. Outside, Marshal Hoyt was packing up. Half his men rode out already, escorting prisoners heading toward Kincaid's last known hideout. The marshal himself stood by the porch rail, whittling a piece of pine with a dull knife. Eli joined him, quiet. "She's not staying," Hoyt said, not looking up. Eli didn't answer. "She's done her part. She never meant to stop here longer than it took to drop those kids off. Truth is, she didn't think you'd even open the door." Eli stared out over the field. The land had changed. Some fences were gone. The barn still smoked. The windmill squeaked with a crack in its spine, but for the first time in years, birds had landed on the fence again. "She thinks she has to keep running," Eli finally said. Hoyt pocketed his knife. "Then stop her." Eli shook his head. "I ain't asking someone to stay if I'm not willing to stay myself." Hoyt grinned. "You just did." That evening, the children sat by the fire. June braided Sarah's hair. Jim and Jake argued over who fed the horses wrong. Emma leaned on Will's shoulder, even though he winced with every movement. Eli sat apart at the window, just watching. And for a second, maybe less, he let himself believe that this might be what forgiveness looked like. Not from the world, but from himself. It was dawn when Clara walked out of the barn. She wore the same travel-worn coat from 3 days ago, now torn at the sleeve. Mud caked her boots. A small bandage wrapped her arm, fresh but not from the gunfight. Her eyes scanned the ranch, steady, like she was memorizing it, or saying goodbye. She found Eli at the well, pumping water one-handed, the other in a sling. He didn't turn when she approached, just kept working the lever, slow and even, like the water would stop if he thought too hard about what to say. Clara was the first to speak. "I'll be leaving by noon." Eli kept pumping. "I've wired Marshal Hoyt. He'll meet me in Santa Fe. We're filing charges, testifying. The whole mess is about to crack open." Water splashed into the bucket. She added, "It'll be safer here once the papers hit the press." Eli stopped, not because he disagreed, but because he didn't know what came next. "You left them," he said at last. Clara's voice caught. "I had to." "No, I mean before." The moment you dropped them off, you stopped being part of this." She stared down at the dirt. They needed someone steadier. They needed you. Inside the house, Will was standing by the doorway. He had heard everything. His shoulders still wrapped, but he stood tall. "You think we didn't know," he said, voice quiet but sharp. "You think we didn't feel it?" Clara blinked. Will stepped closer. "You said we were safe, but you never stayed long enough for us to believe it." Clara looked like someone had just taken her breath and not given it back. Then Sarah, tiny Sarah, walked up, her hand holding a piece of paper, folded in quarters, smudged at the corners. She handed it to Clara and whispered, "Don't go." Clara opened it. 7 names, the same list she'd written before, but now, beneath each one, the kids had added a word in charcoal. Family, home, sister, brother, friend, hope, you. Clara's hand trembled. Eli spoke again, softer this time. "You came here to do good. Maybe it's time you let yourself be good." Clara looked up. She didn't cry. She didn't run. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Then slowly she folded the list and tucked it in her coat pocket. "I guess," she said, voice rough, "some letters don't need postage." That night they made stew from the last of the potatoes and carrots. No one asked what came next. But when Clara took the seat beside the fire and June leaned against her without flinching, the silence felt different, like something was finally still. The snow came late that year, just a soft dusting at first, barely enough to stick, but it brought with it a hush over Silver Hollow, the kind of quiet that wasn't empty, just waiting. And for the first time in years, the wind didn't bite when it blew through Eli Mercer's land. By sunrise, the ranch was alive. Will was hauling fence posts, still favoring his injured shoulder, but gritting through it. Jake and Jim, always together, were learning how to mend the chicken wire with Frank, who'd never actually left. "Just staying a spell till the firewood stacks itself," he said. But no one believed him and no one asked him to go. Emma and Sarah were sweeping out the old shed, giggling at dust and spiders like the war they came from was just a shadow behind them now. And June, she was in the kitchen with Clara, peeling potatoes in silence. But this time the silence was comfortable, like old friends didn't need to fill the air with words. Eli watched from the porch, coffee in hand, steam curling into the pale blue sky. It still felt strange, this noise, this movement, the sound of chores being done not out of survival, but out of habit, out of choice. He walked to the barn, checking hinges, running a hand along the stall wall. Fresh hay, water buckets full, warmth in the air, even without fire. Something unspoken settled in his chest. It wasn't peace, exactly, not yet, but it was a start. That afternoon, Sarah came running, breathless with pride. In her arms was a wooden board, maybe a broken piece of crate sanded roughly. On it, written in thick chalk strokes, were 3 words, "This is home." She set it by the gate, crooked and leaning. Eli didn't fix it. It was perfect as it was. Later, when the fire was crackling low and the stew was nearly done, Clara sat down beside him on the porch. They didn't talk for a long while, just watched the stars blink into place. Eli finally said, "You think they'll stay?" Clara took a slow breath. "Only if we let them." He nodded, then added, almost to himself, "Funny. Feels like they let me." In the yard, Will was helping the twins with the milk buckets. Caleb was mending a broken slat on the window frame. June stepped out with a wool blanket and placed it on Clara's lap without a word. And behind them all, that crooked wooden sign catching the last light of day, soft and certain. "This is home." It was just after sunrise when Clara stood in the barn, staring at the name carved into a beam. Bo, etched deep, old, like someone wanted to be remembered, or to remember themselves. She ran her fingers over the groove, a ghost of a smile pulling at her lips. Eli found her there, eyes shining with something heavy. He didn't ask, just leaned against the stall and waited. After a long silence, she said, "He used to hum when he brushed the horses, off-key, drove Mama crazy." Eli raised a brow. "Your brother?" Clara nodded slowly. "Bo disappeared when I was 15. Folks said he ran off to join the army, but I knew he didn't. He left because he couldn't protect me anymore." She turned to face him. "I saw him. That day, scar across his jaw. Couldn't speak, but it was him." Eli didn't answer right away. Some truths settle like dust, soft but everywhere. "He saved us," Eli finally said. "Didn't need words to do it." Clara's voice cracked. "I didn't even get to say I forgave him." "You did," Eli said gently. "You came back." That evening, word came in by telegram from Marshal Hoyt, short and sharp. "Kincaid caught in Colorado, will face trial. No fanfare, no parade, just justice, plain and cold." The children didn't cheer, but they stood a little taller, as if some invisible weight had been lifted off their shoulders. In the cabin, June sat by the fire, a slate in her lap. She hadn't spoken a word since the day she arrived, not even to Clara, not even in her sleep. But tonight she held up the slate to Sarah and then to Eli, who crouched beside her. In thick, unsteady chalk lines she had written, "Family." Eli didn't know what to say. He just nodded, blinking harder than he liked. June reached out, tugged at his sleeve, then leaned her head lightly against his shoulder. And that was enough. Later, Clara found an old, worn photo tucked inside her satchel. It was of her and Bo, both younger, before the war, before the silence. She placed it beside the hearth, between a jar of buttons and Sarah's wooden home sign. Nothing grand, but it stayed. Outside, the night rolled in soft and full, and the house that once echoed with wind and ghosts now pulsed with quiet breath, with the creak of old floorboards, with belonging. They weren't done healing, but they were no longer alone in it. The morning broke soft over Silver Hollow. Sunlight filtered through the cottonwoods, brushing the worn fence posts with gold. The air carried the scent of dry earth and wood smoke, and from the barn came the gentle clatter of buckets and the hum of chores already begun. Eli stood on the porch, one hand curled around a chipped coffee mug, the other resting on the rail like he'd done 100 mornings before. But this one was different. There was laughter. In the distance, Jake and Jim were chasing each other with wooden swords, hollering like miniature outlaws. Emma had a bucket half her size and was determinedly scooping feed for the chickens. Caleb leaned against the barn door, quiet but not brooding, eyes tracking the twins with half a smirk. Will, bandage long gone, was chopping wood with steady rhythm, every swing clean and controlled, like a man twice his age. June sat near the fire pit, Sarah by her side, both working on a rough quilt made of patched-up memories. And then came the sound that broke something open in Eli's chest, a small, sweet voice from the barn. "Daddy, I'm done milking, but the cow won't move." It was Emma, calling him that word. He didn't move right away, just stood there, letting it wash over him like rain on desert stone. "Daddy!" A word he thought he'd buried with the ashes of his wife. A word he never imagined he'd hear again, let alone deserve. Clara stepped out beside him, wiping flour from her hands. She looked at him, half smiling. "You gonna answer her?" she asked. Eli took a slow breath. "Guess I'd better." He set down the mug, straightened his old shirt, and started down the steps. Not fast, not dramatic, just steady, like a man walking into the life that had quietly been building around him. As he passed Clara, he paused. "Don't suppose you're plannin' on leavin' again?" he asked. She looked at him, eyes gentle, lips curled in that tired, hopeful way of folks who've seen too much but still believe. "No," she said, "not if there's biscuits left to bake and quilts to finish." He nodded once. That was enough. That night, after the chores were done and the stars spilled like sugar across the sky, they all gathered by the fire. No stories were told, no songs sung, just the sound of breathing, the warmth of bodies close, the crackle of flame, and the knowing, unspoken but strong, that this was a family. Eli Mercer, the man who once waited for a stranger to step off a wagon and fix his broken life, had become the anchor for 7 children no one wanted, and a woman who never stopped fighting. And in the quiet of that fire-lit circle, with the sky wide open above, he whispered a truth that didn't need to be written down to be remembered. We don't get to choose who shows up at our door, but we sure as hell get to choose who we keep inside. Some homes ain't built with bricks. They're built with patience and the quiet courage it takes to open a door and let 7 broken souls walk through. In a place called Silver Hollow, under the shade of old pines, Eli Mercer once waited for a mail-order bride, but what he got instead was the kind of family no one teaches you how to raise, only how to love day by dusty day. If you believe, too, that we don't get to choose who shows up, but we can choose who stays, drop a simple 1 in the comments. Maybe, just maybe, that's all it takes to start something good.